morning and welcome to this morning's webinar, MSI Back to Basics. I'm Cheryl Osborne, MSI Prevention Advisor with Workplace NL. Workplace NL with the Prevention Services Department, and today's topic is MSI Back to Basics. This is the first webinar during Move Well, Work Well week, which happens to be this week, starting yesterday. So as the image depicts in here, everyone has a role in MSI prevention. It starts with each and every one of us. We can often minimize our own risk to ourselves of musculoskeletal injuries by selecting appropriate clothing to wear to work. Footwear that promotes good posture. Posture is very important to prevent MSIs, and that's a big part of today's conversation. Sometimes we can minimize our own risk by choosing supportive footwear or at least taking things like sneakers, good clothing to be able to take meaningful breaks from work throughout the day, have an active break from work. So today's webinar is part of the learning series, prevention learning series, which is designed and delivered by staff at Workplace NL to increase the education and awareness of occupational health and safety and return to work in the workplace. The workshops and webinars address the injury priorities and fulfill the strategic mandate of Workplace NL, and MSI prevention is certainly one of our top injury strategic priorities. Today's webinar is part of the learning series. Serving approximately 215,000 workers and 18,000 employers, Workplace NL administers employer-funded no-fault insurance systems that promote safe and healthy workplaces, provides return-to-work programs, and offers compensation to injured workers and their dependents. Workplace NL has 3 lines of business: education on the prevention of workplace injuries, illnesses, and occupational disease, claims management for injured workers, and employer assessments. Insurance coverage. A few housekeeping items. In the handouts section, you're going to find a PDF copy of the presentation that you can download and save for later reference. I encourage you to ask questions, and if you do ask a question, please type, or want to ask a question, please type it in the chat window. I will respond to questions most likely at the end of the presentation. However, there will be points throughout the webinar this morning where I'll ask you questions, and you will use the chat box there as well to answer my questions. And if we run out of time at the end, I will respond to your questions via email. You're going to receive an evaluation form at the end of the webinar, and I do encourage you to complete that evaluation. It helps us develop better and more meaningful webinars, and if you could please also include any topics of interest that you would like to see us present on a webinar or workshop on in the future, that would be great, as we certainly take your feedback seriously. And lastly, with respect to housekeeping, is micro breaks. So every 30 minutes, I'm going to ask you to stand and stretch or move around, get the blood flowing back to your body again. Micro breaks are one example of an administrative control for MSI prevention. So first question for today is, what is one thing that you would like to take away from today's webinar? If you could just write a few responses in the chat box, that would be great. How to prevent back injuries. That's great. So today in the webinar, we're going to talk about ways to prevent a number of different musculoskeletal injuries, but certainly there's going to be a focus on back health. Tips to help prevent MSI. Great. All right, so you're in the right webinar for that. Thanks, guys. So today we're going to review and discuss the roles and responsibilities of workers, supervisors, and other workplace parties, because as I said at the beginning, we all have a role in MSI prevention, and our roles feed into one another to make an effective, to have an effective MSI prevention process. We'll talk about worker education and instruction and principles of body mechanics and neutral postures for sitting and standing, where we're going to really focus on back health. Musculoskeletal injuries, or MSI for short, are costly for employers, and the time for workers to rehabilitate from these injuries and disorders are and actually possibly return to full work capacity, because sometimes that's not the case. But when we are able to return to full work capacity after an MSI, that time is often quite lengthy. These injuries account for 68% of all claims involving lost time from work, 71% of all the costs related to lost time claims in our province, and 76% of all lost time weeks from work. On average, every single year, these claim costs account for about $96 million in claims costs. So they're quite costly claims. Our province sets aside a week each September to raise awareness about the impact of these injuries in the workplace and find practical solutions for prevention. It's called Move Well, Work Well Week, and it happens to be this very week, as I mentioned. Many of employers in our province are putting off workplace campaigns this week, and that might in part be the reason why you're sitting in on today's webinar. Move Well, Work Well reminds us that when we move often, rather than being sedentary or staying in one position for too long, and when we move well by using good body mechanics, it results in us being well and working well. We're productive, comfortable, healthy, and our risk of MSI is reduced. Essentially, when we move well, we work well. This week is intended for workplaces to dedicate time towards education and training on how to prevent repetitive strain and overexertion type injuries. Move Well, Work Well Week is unique to Newfoundland and Labrador. We are the only province who marks this important week. There are other well-known campaigns dedicated to MSI prevention. Some are national campaigns, some are global. You may have heard of RSI Day, or Repetitive Strain Injury Day, which is always marked in February of each year. There's also Global Ergonomics Month, which takes place in October. Move Well, Work Well Week, though, is unique to Newfoundland and Labrador, and it's been around now for, this is the 20th year. We want to continually increase the number of organizations who mark this important week so that together we can make a healthier NL. Please visit our website. We are actually doing a feedback survey, an employer feedback survey at this time, where we want to hear from employers, employer representatives, about how we might help you plan your next campaign. So perhaps this year you don't have a campaign in your workplace, but you're interested in planning one for future years. Well, the feedback survey is an opportunity for you to tell us how Workplace NL might be able to assist. For example, you might be looking for a specific resource or a specific service from Workplace NL. And we do take that feedback quite serious. And actually the recordings for this week's webinars are part of us listening to last year's feedback survey. So there was requests to have webinars made available throughout the week, 24/7, as opposed to just being able to attend them live. So this webinar, as well as the other 4 Move Well, Work Well, or MSI prevention webinars taking place this week, will all be recorded and downloaded on Workplace NL's YouTube channel, hopefully the same day as the live webinar. In other words, today's this current webinar should be available by end of day today on our YouTube channel. Workplace NL has also partnered with MadeSafe NL, which is the safety sector for manufacturing and processing sectors. We've partnered with them to co-facilitate a webinar this week as well, which happens on Thursday at 2 o'clock. I believe it's 2 o'clock to 3 o'clock, but you'll just want to double check by checking on MadeSafe NL's website. So they are the ones who are hosting this particular webinar. It's specifically on Msi Hazard recognition, evaluation, and control, where we really get specific into those 2 industries, manufacturing and processing. So if you're interested in registering for that webinar, Tina has actually sent out a link. Thank you, Tina, to register, and that's where you will find the actual time too. But I believe it's 2 o'clock p.m. on Thursday. And this is MadeSafe NL's way of showing support for Move Well, Work Well Week 2. All right, so moving on. Musculoskeletal injuries. These are injuries or disorders of muscles, tendons, ligaments, joints, nerves, blood vessels, and related soft tissues. They include sprains, strains, and inflammation, as well as a host of other injuries and disorders. Some examples are tendonitis, carpal tunnel syndrome, epicondylitis, a pinched nerve, various back disorders such as a herniated disc, sciatica. Those are some of the real common ones that we see claims for. But there's many, many more MSIs as well that we are certainly seeing claims for. So the term MSI is an umbrella term that we use to refer to the many different injuries and disorders to soft tissues in the body. They can occur anywhere in the body, but we often see them in the back. That is the most common body part where we see MSIs occurring. We also see a lot in the shoulders, the neck, the elbows and wrists, also the knees. They can result from a single traumatic event, like lifting a load that's too heavy for the individual who's lifting the load, or they can develop gradually over time as a result of cumulative damage. So it could be the lifting of lighter loads, but on a regular basis, or working for prolonged periods at a workstation that's too high, leading to chronic conditions, chronic damage, wear and tear. Ligaments are a piece of soft tissue that we often see MSIs to. Ligaments connect bones to bones. So they're part of our connective tissues that help make the skeletal system move and function the way it does. Ligaments are affected, they can be stretched or torn, and these types of things can happen from prolonged awkward postures. For example, having the back bent forward for a prolonged period. It could be somebody who is stationary at a desk, seated in a chair, and they slouch forward in the chair for a good part of their day, and they do that day in, day out. It can cause the ligaments in the spine to stretch. It's called ligament creep, and that sustained stretching can cause the ligaments to become permanently stretched, and that leaves the spine more unstable and leaves the individual at a greater risk of experiencing a back injury down the road, probably from some more mundane type activities, lesser force demands, lesser loads on the spine. They're not able to tolerate as much because they have an unstable spine. Ligaments can also be damaged by peak or high force demands. For example, a ligament sprain in the ankle from a slip or fall or rolling the ankle. We have tendons. Tendons are the tissue that connects our muscles to the bones. So they're a soft tissue as well. And those can also be stretched or torn. And if they are, we call them tendon strains. These can happen from awkward postures, for example, overhead reaching on a regular basis or frequently, or holding these types of postures for long periods, and can also happen from sudden force. We can also inflame tendons. The word to describe inflamed tendons is tendonitis, and that typically happens because of repeated movements. And it's often repeated movements about the shoulder, the elbows, the wrists, and the knees. Those are the common locations for tendonitis or tendonitis type problems. Some common terms for tendonitis, and it sometimes depends on the location, but you might have heard of terms like tennis elbow, golfer's elbow, pitcher's shoulder, swimmer's shoulder, jumper's knee. Those are all various tendonitis problems and all MSIs. Using proper technique is important when we're performing repetitive job-related activities and sports movements as well, because it can happen in sports too. Improper technique can overload the tendon. Muscles are tissues that contract to create movement. We have several muscles in the body, and they can become fatigued, stretched, or torn based on the way we use them to do our work. A muscle needs oxygen, fuel, and nutrients to come in and out of the muscle at an optimal rate. And we need the waste products that build up in muscles to be able to get expelled. So that means that the muscles need good, healthy blood flow in and out of the muscle. But when we don't have good blood flow, then the muscles fatigue. And one of the reasons why we don't have good blood flow to the muscles is because we work in awkward postures. In an awkward posture, which means working outside of the neutral posture, and I'm going to explain that now in a moment, then blood is not able to flow freely in and out of the muscle. So fatigue develops, and that causes gradual wear and tear on the muscles over time with continuous exposure or regular exposure. A muscle can also be strained or tore from sudden awkward posture, a sudden peak force, and in an awkward posture. It typically happens when there's exposure to awkward posture with a force. For example, a strained muscle in the back may be the result of lifting a load, so there's force demands, in addition to lifting the load with poor body mechanics or poor posture. Nerves. These are the communication system in our body that links muscles, tendons, and other tissues to the brain, links them with the brain. Nerves can be pulled and pinched, usually caused by awkward postures, working regularly with awkward postures, and they can also be compressed. An example is a nerve compression in the wrist, the median nerve. It's compressed because of potentially contact stress in the wrist. So the wrist is being rested against a solid structure like the desk, the front edge of a desk, or even just laid on top of a desk when we're typing, for example. And it can also be caused by continuous gripping of a tool where the muscles are continuously contracted in the arm for long periods of time, and that reduces the space in the carpal tunnel. And that puts strain, compresses the median nerve. It could be also from a lot of repetitive twisting of the wrist. Then we have our spinal discs. These act as cushions between the vertebrae in our spine. They're composed of an outer layer of tough cartilage that surrounds softer cartilage in the center. It might help to think of them as miniature jelly donuts, exactly the right size to fit between your vertebrae. The outer wall of a disc may become thin or weakened, and this is known as a bulging disc. A bulging disc is like letting air out of a car tire. The disc sags, and it looks like it is bulging outward. With a herniated disc, however, the outer covering of the disc has a hole or tear. This causes the jelly-like center of the disc to leak into the spinal canal. Compared with a bulging disc, a herniated disc is more likely to cause pain because it generally protrudes farther and is more likely to irritate nerve roots. The irritation can be from compression of the nerve, or perhaps more commonly, the herniation causes a painful inflammation of the nerve root. If your spinal nerve is aggravated, you might experience weakness, sensation changes, or pain into one or both even of your legs. Movements and postures that involve repeated or prolonged back bending or twisting or compression of the intervertebral discs, such as excessive loading from manual material handling, causes the fibers which make up the ring of the disc to start to break down, and it can lead to these kinds of problems with the spinal discs. The signs and symptoms of MSI are not the same for every disorder and condition. There's many different ones, and they can range from very minor discomfort and can develop into quite severe and debilitating pain. Signs and symptoms might present immediately as a result of an acute injury, such as the obvious of lifting something that was beyond our capacity and having an immediate injury. But more often, the MSIs, the signs and symptoms, appear gradually over time, and they progressively worsen if we don't get rid of the risk factors that are causing the issues in the first place. With COVID, for those of you who may have worked from home for a period of time, and perhaps some of you still are, you might have experienced some back discomfort or some potentially even pain after a while, because a lot of us had difficulties with setting up an ideal workstation in the home environment. So we might not have had great support for the back. Some common signs and symptoms to look for would be pain, aches, tenderness, soreness, or discomfort that persists day to day or interferes with activities of work or daily living, weakness, tightness, stiffness, redness or swelling, which are signs of inflammation, reduced range of motion about a body part, numbness, shooting or burning sensations, which could be an indication of nerve problems, or just general feelings of fatigue. Discomfort that persists from day to day or interferes with activities of work or daily living should not be considered an acceptable outcome of work. It is important that workers be educated about the signs and symptoms of MSI so that they can recognize early when an MSI may be developing. It's not only important, but it's a legislative responsibility of employers to educate their workers on this. OHS legislation provides the foundation for healthy and safe workplaces. It is the employer's duty to build on this foundation to create workplaces where occupational health and safety, including MSI prevention and ergonomics, is incorporated into all aspects of the business functions. In addition, it is their duty to ensure that workplace parties understand their responsibilities in keeping them and others safe. Legislation outlines the roles and responsibilities for each piece of the puzzle or each workplace party. The duties of employers, supervisors, and workers complement each other. Employers and supervisors have the general duty to protect the health and safety of workers, and workers have the responsibility to take care of themselves and others while working. These general duties inform then specific duties. With regards to MSI, they are: employers must identify job tasks that may expose workers to the risk of MSIs, evaluate the risk, and implement controls that includes equipment, education and training, and safe work practices and procedures. Employers must select the most appropriate equipment or equivalent control that will reduce workers' risk to MSIs, must provide instruction to workers in the use of equipment and associated safe work practices and procedures, and their responsibilities in using the equipment. Supervisors must advise workers of the Msi hazards that they may be exposed to and safe work practices and procedures that they are to follow. They must enforce the requirements of using ergonomic equipment and follow safe work practices and procedures, and provide instructions to workers in the use of this equipment and safe work practices and procedures. And workers must report Msi hazards associated with job tasks to their employer. Typically, it's to their supervisor. They must follow safe work practices and procedures as instructed and participate in education and training sessions. An employer shall consult with the OH&S committee or Occupational Health and Safety Committee, worker health and safety representative, or workplace health and safety designate when performing a risk assessment required by the regulations. So the OH&S regulations in Newfoundland have 7 sections that pertain specifically to MSI prevention. Sections 50 to 54 speak to the programming requirements of employers. Sections 50 to 51 require employers to recognize factors in the workplace that may expose workers to a risk of MSI, evaluate the risk, and establish controls for workers to implement or follow. Section 52 requires employers to educate and train workers. There will be more detail on that in the next slides. Employers must continually monitor the effectiveness of controls and ensure that controls are implemented without delay. That's section 53. And section 54 says that employers must, during a risk assessment process, consult with workers, which includes the OH&S committee or reps designates, workers who have signs and symptoms of MSIs, as well as a representative sample of the workers performing the work that is being assessed. So that a representation would be if it's a 24/7 operation where there's multiple shifts, well then having representation from workers on each shift, having representation based on heights of workers, based on age of workers, perhaps even gender of workers, but full representation nonetheless of the workers performing the work, workers who are having signs and symptoms as well. And sections 55 and 56 cover specific requirements for seating and standing work and lifting and handling. So back to section 52 for a moment, MSI Education and Training. This section requires employers to educate workers in the MSI risk factors, in the signs and symptoms of MSI and the potential health effects of the risk factors, and they must train workers in the control measures that the company has implemented. Section 55 and 56 outline controls for workers who sit and stand and those who lift and handle materials or products. Employers, therefore, must train workers in these controls, such as how to properly use the equipment they provide to the workers. Both these sections provide requirements that will help prevent back injuries. Seating or standing work, prolonged sitting, and static standing, there's increased incidence of back pain and back troubles with these particular activities. So Section 55 says that where a worker is in the course of his or her work, they have a reasonable opportunity to sit without detriment to his or her work. An employer shall maintain and provide and maintain suitable seating for the worker's use to enable him or her to take advantage of that opportunity. So where there's a reasonable opportunity to sit without detriment, an employer shall provide and maintain suitable seating. Subsection 2 is that where a substantial proportion of work can be done while seated, so substantial proportion, an employer shall provide and maintain for a worker a seat suitably designed, constructed, dimensioned, and supported for the worker to do the work, including where necessary, a footrest that can readily and comfortably support the feet. And subsection 3 says where a worker is required to stand for long periods in the course of his or her work, an employer or contractor shall provide an anti-fatigue mat, footrest, or other suitable device to provide relief. And then for the lifting and handling piece, section 56, subsection 1 says that an employer or contractor shall ensure where reasonably practicable that suitable equipment is provided and used for the handling of heavy and awkward loads. And subsection 2 is where the use of equipment is not reasonably practicable, an employer or contractor shall take all practicable means to adapt heavy or awkward loads to facilitate lifting, holding, or transporting by workers, or they must otherwise minimize the manual handling required by workers. And I should add as well that overexertions in lifting is the #1 single cause of back injuries in our province. The interruption there a moment ago was my alarm to tell me that 30 minutes are up and it's now time to take a micro break. So I'm going to ask everybody to get up from their chair if you have been sitting for the duration so far of the webinar, and move around, move your limbs, perhaps take a little walk down the hallway or through your hall if you're your own hall if you're in your own home. Grab a glass of water, use the washroom, whatever the case is, but get the blood flowing back through your legs again and your back and so on and so forth by having a change in posture. Okay, we're back. So we're going to start back with a poll question. So this is the first question for you today. And I'm going to ask you to just respond in the chat window. The question is, MSI legislation is applicable to, #1, workplaces with less than 10 workers, #2, workplaces with 10 or more workers, or #3, all of the above. Okay, and 100% of the audience selected #3, all of the above. You are correct. MSI hazards are in every workplace, in every occupation, in every industry, and it doesn't matter the size of the organization. MSI risk factors, at the very least, are present in every single organization. Here are some examples of job tasks that introduce MSI risk factors to the workplace. Using manual handling tools frequently, exposing you to repetitive motions, sitting at a desk, pushing or pulling objects, using vibrating equipment such as concrete saws, cutting with knives, where we have that constant muscle contraction to grip the tool, and repetitive motions, making beds in hospitality and healthcare and other similar industries. MSI hazards are created by people, equipment, material, and the environment. When we're looking for MSI hazards, we need to look at all these factors. So here is the list of MSI hazards or risk factors. We kind of use those terms interchangeably when we talk about MSIs. The first four, the ones in bold, are the most common. These are, I guess, the most prevalent risk factors in the workplace, and the ones that are contributing to the majority of the lost time claims in our province: awkward postures, sustained postures, forceful exertions, and repetitive motions. And the first three, in fact, are probably the ones that are the, I guess, the biggest contributors to back injuries. But we also have other MSI risk factors in the workplace that we need to be mindful of and aware of if they exist, and make sure that we evaluate the level of risk. That's local contact stresses, vibration, insufficient lighting, and adverse temperatures. So the top four are the most common. Let's start with awkward postures. Where the posture required for the task creates some discomfort, is difficult to maintain, or deviates significantly from neutral, then it's considered to be an awkward posture. Avoid postures and movements that put you in awkward positions, because they actually put more stress and strain on the soft tissues of the body. What makes them harmful in work situations is the continual holding or repetition of the posture, often in a forceful manner. All right, so awkward postures. Where the posture required for the task creates some discomfort, is difficult to maintain, or deviates significantly from neutral, that's considered an awkward posture. Some postures that we want to avoid or reduce include reaching in front of the body or to one side. That puts us at risk of back injuries. Twisting the back as well, bending the back forward or to one side, reaching overhead, bending or twisting the wrists, turning or bending the neck, and kneeling, squatting, and stooping. And of course, these things, when done just here and there and every now and again, are not an issue. It is the duration and frequency of exposure that we need to be considering, as well as the magnitude of the posture. So how awkward the posture is. And the more awkward it is, the further the body segment moves away from its resting position, which is the position shown on the screen here. The farther your body segment moves away from that upright neutral position, then the more awkward the posture is and the higher the risk of injury. So the more awkward, the higher the duration of exposure or the frequency of exposure, the higher the risk of injury. Sustained postures. Are you stationary while doing your job, or can you move about? Regardless whether you're holding one body part or your entire body in a static position, it is important to understand that holding any position for long periods places stress on your tissues. Staying in one posture without movement of joints places prolonged loading on the muscles, and it results in fatigue, making the muscles prone to injury. Some examples are sitting, a common cause for low back pain; standing, likewise, a common cause for low back pain; raising the shoulders to work at a table that's too high; holding your arms in front of your body because the work is too far away; elevating your arms in overhead work; continuous holding of an object or tool; or continuous stooping or crouching. Again, another risk for back problems. Forceful exertions or overexertions, again, the #1 cause of back injuries. Force is the amount of physical effort required to perform a task, like heavy lifting, or to maintain control of or use equipment and tools. The job might involve high amounts of force or the accumulation of lesser amounts of force on your body over a period of time. The amount of force depends on the type of grip, the weight and size of an object, our body posture when we're handling an object, and the type of activity and the duration of the task. Tasks that require forceful exertions, which commonly tend to be manual handling activities like lifting, lowering, carrying, pushing, and pulling, they place higher loads on the muscles, tendons, ligaments, and joints. Increasing force means increasing body demands, such as greater muscle exertion, along with other physiological changes necessary to sustain an increased effort. Prolonged or recurrent experiences of this type can give rise to not only feelings of fatigue, but may also lead to musculoskeletal injury problems when there's inadequate time for rest and recovery because the tolerance of the tissues decline. Force requirements may increase with increased weight of a load handled, increased bulkiness of the load handled, use of an awkward posture, the speeding up of movements, increased slipperiness of the object handled, requiring an increased grip force, the presence of vibration, for example, localized vibration from powered hand tools. This leads to the use of increased grip force. The use of the index finger and thumb to forcefully grip an object, in other words, using a pinched grip compared to a power grip, such as gripping an object with the whole hand. As well, the use of small or narrow tool handles that lessen grip capacity. Those are all great examples of forceful exertions. Repetitive motions. Doing the same motions over and over again places stress on the muscles and tendons. The severity of risk depends on how often the action is repeated, the speed of the movement, the number of muscles involved, and the required force. If motions are repeated frequently and for long periods, such as over an 8-hour shift, for example, fatigue and muscle tendon strain can accumulate. It has to do with the effect on blood flow to the affected tissues, which impact that normal supply of oxygen and fuel and nutrients, which can gradually decline the tissue's tolerance. Tendons and muscles can often recover from the effects of stretching or forceful exertions if sufficient time is allotted between exertions. Effects of repetitive motions from performing the same work activities are increased when awkward postures and forceful exertions are involved. In relation to the repeated handling of loads, the more repetitive the task, the lower the load should be for the body's tissues to withstand the accumulation of workload. Repetitive actions as a risk factor can also depend on the body area and specific act being performed. Repetitive work using awkward back postures is a recipe for back injury. Local contact stresses. Pressing the body against a hard or sharp object or edge can result in placing too much pressure on nerves, tendons, and blood vessels. For example, using the palm of your hand as a hammer can increase your risk of suffering an MSI. Non-rounded desk or table edges, leaning against them. Unpadded narrow tool handles could create pressure over one area, such as the forearm or your palm or side of your fingers. Similarly, holding a tool with a handle that contains ridges that dig into the sides of the fingers. Kneeling to do floor level work without using knee pads, like laying carpet or hardwood. Knee kicking to stretch carpet. Common body parts affected by contact stress are the knees, shoulders, the elbows, hands and fingers, wrists, and the waist or the stomach from leaning into a workstation or desk. Vibration. Tools or heavy machines that repeatedly shake sends forces through the body. Workers who use vibrating tools, machinery, or equipment where vibration has not been controlled may put themselves at risk of MSIs. The risk of vibration-induced injury depends on the average daily exposure. An evaluation of the risk takes into account the intensity and frequency of the vibration exposure, the duration, such as years of exposure, and the part of the body which receives the vibration energy. There's two types of vibration exposure: segmental vibration exposure and whole body vibration exposure. When a specific organ, part, or segment of the body comes in contact with a vibrating object, such as a powered hand tool, it's known as segmental vibration. The most widely studied and most common type of segmental vibration exposure is hand-arm vibration exposure, which affects, obviously, the hands and arms. Exposed occupational groups include operators of jackhammers, grinders, chainsaws, chipping tools, jackleg drills, and many other handheld vibrating tools like the ones pictured. Sanders, lawnmowers, rock drills, and mining, etc., etc. Typically, it's years of exposure before symptoms develop. The health conditions do progress slowly. Vibration-induced white finger is the most common condition among the operators of handheld vibrating tools. The symptoms of vibration-induced white finger are aggravated when the hands are exposed to cold. Vibration can cause changes in tendons, muscles, bones, and joints, and can affect the nervous system as well. Typically, it's the collection of these effects that are referred to as hand-arm vibration syndrome. Workers affected by HAVS, or hand-arm vibration syndrome, commonly report attacks of whitening or blanching of one or more fingers when exposed to the cold, tingling and loss of sensation in the fingers, a loss of light touch, pain and cold sensations between periodic white finger attacks, loss of grip strength, bone cysts in the fingers and wrists. We can feel vibration and know that people might be exposed to it, but we can't determine if what we are feeling is going to be harmful. And for that, we must measure vibration exposure. The American Conference of Governmental Industrial Hygienists, also known as ACGIH, has published exposure recommendations for prevention of hand, arm, and whole body vibration. ACGIH also say that in addition to adhering to the threshold limit values, control of hand-arm vibration syndrome in the workplace also requires the use of anti-vibration tools, anti-vibration gloves to dampen the vibration at high frequencies, proper work practices that keep the worker's hands and remaining body warm, as well as a conscientiously applied medical surveillance program. Using vibrating hand tools can increase the presence of more risk factors as well. The worker may be exposed to increased force and awkward postures because the tools are harder to control. And if there is a loss of sensation in the fingers, the worker may misjudge the amount of force needed to control the tool and consequently use more force. Whole body vibration. So exposure to the whole body, exposure to whole body vibration can occur while standing or sitting in vibrating environments or objects, such as when operating heavy equipment vehicles or large machinery. As the name implies, the vibration can affect the whole body or a number of organs. These are some sources. Exposed groups include operators of trucks, buses, tractors, and those who work on vibrating floors, with exposure levels typically being highest among operators who drive off-road or over rough terrain, such as on construction sites and forestry roads. However, vibration is also present on our province's roadways, among truck drivers in the transportation industry, for example. Whole body vibration can cause fatigue, stomach problems, headache, loss of balance, and shakiness shortly after or during exposure. The symptoms are similar to those that many people experience after a long car or boat trip. After daily exposure over a number of years, whole body vibration can affect the entire body and result in a number of health disorders. Studies of bus and truck drivers found that occupational exposure to whole body vibration could have contributed to a number of circulatory, bowel, respiratory, muscular, and back disorders. The combined effects of body posture, postural fatigue, dietary habits, and whole body vibration are the possible causes for these disorders. Another important fact, there's an increased risk of low back injury to workers if whole body vibration exposure is combined with awkward postures. Vibration travels more readily through the spine when the spine is twisted. An example would be a forklift driver, as in the picture on the slide, whose back is twisted. Again, the ACGIH also has published exposure recommendations for prevention of whole body vibration. Number 7 is insufficient lighting. Poor lighting can be an MSI hazard. Too much or too little light can strain the eyes and cause discomfort, such as burning, and headaches. Insufficient lighting, like glare, can also adversely affect posture, resulting in someone adopting an awkward posture to see their work. Shadows, for example, cast in a room may be a problem for painters. Fluorescent lights that flicker can strain the eyes and cause headaches. And finally, adverse temperatures. Very warm and very cold work environments increase the physical demands of work. Working in cold temperatures can increase your risk of MSIs. This occurs because muscles tend to be cold and tight. They feel numb and are less flexible. When we're cold, blood flow gets directed to our vital organs. Cold temperatures reduce the blood flow to the soft tissues, resulting in reduced nutrient, fuel, and oxygen supply, increases muscle fatigue, lack of tissue repair, and it results in a decreased tissue tolerance. Cold muscles and joints have reduced range of motion, reduced coordination and strength. Cold tends to reduce tactile sensation in the fingers and hands. So when a worker attempts to handle an object, they tend to grip it harder, leading to increased workload on tissues. Heat and humidity. When it's too hot, a similar scenario is in play, such as an increased force demands. When we sweat, objects become slippery, so we tend to grip harder. Working in a hot or humid environment puts more strain on your entire body by increasing your body's temperature, and it increases dehydration. This is mainly a concern for heat stress or heat stroke, but it could also lead to increased muscle fatigue and errors in how work is done. Increased rest time is required to allow the muscles to recover and maintain an ideal body temperature. Spot the hazard number 1. Now I'm going to ask you to use your chat box and to write down which MSI risk factors or potential hazards you see in the picture on the screen. There's 3 risk factors or hazards in particular. Just give you a moment to write in the chat window. The wrist position, right? So awkward postures of both wrists, in fact. So the right wrist is bent, the left bent down in flexion, and the left wrist is bent sideways, deviation. Correct? Risks of falling for sure. Vibration exposure for sure. Yeah, I actually didn't even think to consider vibration in this one, but definitely you picked up on that one. Thank you for that. Forceful exertions too, potentially, because he's working with his arm in a real awkward posture over his head, and that increases force demands on his neck and shoulder and arm muscles too, and potentially could be some sustained postures going on there too with the continuous gripping, continuous muscle contraction in the arms. Reaching above the shoulder. And no protection for sure. No gloves. Excellent, guys, excellent. All right, next picture. Which risk factors or hazards are present in picture number 2? Postures, yes, common problem with general office workers or people who work with computers on a regular basis. The chair, improper support for sure. Looks like she's not even able to sit with her back into the backrest of the chair, so she has no back support. Awkward neck posture, definitely. I think she's hunched over like that because she's trying to relieve some discomfort potentially because of having to have her neck bent down regularly, which is very fatiguing on those small muscles in the neck. Desk setup, monitors below eye level. Yeah, absolutely. Good pickups there. So we got awkward postures, sustained postures, and certainly repetitive motions or movements with computer work, repetitive keying and mousing. Great. And what about the last picture, number 3? Which MSI risk factors may be present here, or hazards may be present? Vibration exposure, yes, for sure. Awkward postures, the neck is bent down, the back is bent sideways and slightly twisted as well. And also potentially there could be some exposure to forceful exertions going on here too. Great. No face protection, correct. I didn't include that in my answers specifically because I'm looking more to the MSI hazards for the purpose of this webinar, but you're absolutely right. No face protection. We have to look at the whole picture, don't we, when we're doing a risk assessment. Okay, so now let's look at risk evaluation for MSI, risk factors and hazards. Severity refers to the loss most likely to occur. Probability looks at how likely the loss associated with the task will occur. And then we use this equation, severity plus or severity times probability equals risk. The higher the value, if you do this, use this formula to assess a couple of different tasks. The task that presents the highest value means the highest level of risk, which means we would assess that task or control that task first, implement controls first and foremost. That would be our priority task, to control first. When we're looking at the risk of MSI, severity and probability is affected by the magnitude of the hazard. So let's just look at awkward posture, for example. The more awkward the posture is, the higher the higher the level of risk. Or forceful exertions, the heavier the load or the farther it is away from the body, the higher the risk due to higher forceful exertion. So the magnitude of exposure plays a role in the severity and or probability that an MSI might occur. So does the duration of exposure. Increased duration obviously equals increased risk, and the frequency of exposure. Increased frequency equals increased risk. So all of these increase the probability and potential severity too of the MSI, but they certainly increase the probability that someone will experience an MSI. So we need to be assessing the magnitude, duration, and frequency of exposure to all of the risk factors present in a task. That's the signal for a micro break. I'm just going to finish this last slide here, and then we'll take our micro break. So what does or what would increase the risk of injury in this particular picture, which was the first picture that we assessed? We identified the risk factors for. Well, the magnitude. The wrist is bent at 90 degrees. That's a pretty significant awkward posture, and therefore there's a pretty good probability of an injury. It's a highly awkward posture. Duration. If this worker was to do this task for, say, 6 hours a day, well, then that's a greater level of risk than 1 hour a day. And frequency. If he was drilling or using this screwdriver, I guess it is, using the drill 30 times an hour, as opposed to doing it just 1 time an hour, of course, the level of risk would change. All right, so before we move into the controls, I'll just take another quick micro break, probably for about 1.5 minutes or so, and we'll get back to it. Okay, we're back. This last section now, this last 30 minutes is all about controlling the risks of MSI in the workplace. So to start, what an employer should start with in regards to preventing MSIs is to implement an MSI prevention program, which consists of the elements listed on the slide. First and foremost, we want to have management commitment. Commitment begins with the owner or the CEO, and it includes having an MSI prevention policy or statement that governs its actions and procedures that define specific approaches that the organization is going to take to prevent MSI. Employers want to establish a process for identifying, assessing, and controlling MSI hazards. This is actually the basis of MSI prevention regulations in our province, right? Sections 50 to 54 says that employers need to have that process for identifying, evaluating, and controlling MSI risk factors and hazards. So we want to be looking for hazards during regular workplace inspections, for example, observing for awkward postures and excessive force and high rates of repetition. Evaluate suspected jobs for potential risk factors. Review reports of MSI concerns and hazards from workers. Consider potential MSI hazards when making any changes in the workplace. Establish a process for assessing MSI risk and make sure that all workers are aware of how MSI hazards will be identified and controlled in your workplace. You want to have worker participation. Involve workers as fully informed active participants. Encourage early reporting of symptoms by workers. Work toward a culture of open communication by encouraging open discussions with all levels of the organization about hazards. Educate all workplace parties in the organization in their roles and specific responsibilities in MSI prevention, and train them in the hazards and specific controls for their work. Plan to prevent MSIs by focusing efforts on preventing MSI hazards from coming into the workplace in the first place, such as when purchasing new workstation equipment or tools. In most cases, it's much less expensive to design MSI hazards out of the planning, design them in, let me back up. In most cases, it's less expensive to design MSI hazards out in the planning, design, and purchasing and installation stages than it is to add controls later to manage MSIs, because now you're into the whole retrofit piece, and it's often very difficult to redesign a particular workstation. And not only that, we might potentially have MSI claims, which can be quite costly. So it's usually much less expensive to just design the MSI hazards out in the first place. You want to implement job-specific controls. These include engineering controls and administrative controls. Personal protective equipment might be appropriate under some limited circumstances, but they are usually used in combination with other controls. We want to follow the hierarchy of controls. So first and foremost, we want to, as I said, eliminate the hazard in the first place. But if the hazard is present in the workplace, well, then we want to next try and substitute potentially the hazard. So as an example, maybe use an ergonomic type stapler versus a traditional one. So there's much less force to have to use the stapler. Then where we tend to see the majority of the controls for MSI prevention is in the engineering section. So engineering controls, an example would be using mechanical assists like tool balancers, spring-loaded support cables to suspend heavy tools, providing the worker with a near weightless use of a tool. Then we move into administrative type controls. They're the next effective line of defense. These reduce risk through reduction of exposure time and sharing the exposure among a larger group of workers. Essentially, it involves changing safe work practices or procedures. So for example, implementing work standards that permit workers to pause and stretch as necessary, task variety, job rotation, those sort of things. And then of course, PPE, or personal protective equipment. As I said, typically they're used in combination with other controls, and they would include things like knee pads, anti-vibration gloves, perhaps shock absorbing insoles or soles in your footwear, good supportive footwear. Those are a few examples of PPE. Now let's look at body mechanics. There is a relationship between how humans use their bodies to do work and the risk of MSI. We'll talk about this relationship through the rest of the webinar. For now, learning and using proper body mechanics is an administrative control that's used in an MSI prevention program. So in our safe work procedures, whoops, forgot to turn off my reminder for my micro break. Okay. So in your safe work procedures, if there's a specific way that a worker should be moving their body to do their work activity, for example, lifting a load, well, then it would be important to incorporate body mechanics principles into your safe work practices and procedures. Don't overload your body with more than it can handle. Muscles, ligaments, intervertebral discs, and other connective tissues work together to help us move, and each of us have limits, or each of those tissues have limits for how much they can be compressed, twisted, and pulled before they begin to break down. Essentially, the body has a limit of what it can handle in each individual tissue. Ergonomics prevents and corrects MSI hazards because ergonomics principles allows us to use proper body mechanics when we design a workplace based on ergonomics principles. Ergonomics is the science of fitting jobs to the people who work in them. The goal of a workplace ergonomics program is to reduce work-related MSIs employees may develop when a major part of their jobs involve ergonomic risk factors, such as reaching, bending over, lifting heavy objects, using continuous force, working with vibrating equipment, and doing repetitive motions. Ergonomics provides the framework for designing and assigning controls to prevent MSIs with 9 basic principles. Work in neutral postures. Keep everything within easy reach so you can maintain a neutral sitting or standing posture when going about your work. Reduce excessive force. Reduce excessive motions. Minimize fatigue and static loading. Provide clearance. Move, exercise, and stretch. Maintain a comfortable environment. That would be thermal comfort, noise and vibration control, and adequate lighting. The principles that we're going to cover today are working in neutral postures and ways to move, exercise, and stretch throughout your workday. So posture. This refers to the position of a body part in relation to an adjoining body part. So posture can relate to standing, sitting, or the position of a particular joint. Neutral posture is another way of saying that a posture is good or natural or ideal. It's when joints are in their resting position. In neutral posture, joints are under minimal stress or strain. The connective tissues supporting your joints, your ligaments and your tendons, are neither stretched nor shortened, and blood flows both in and out of your tissues optimally. In addition, the spine is maintained in its natural S shape, which I'll get into shortly. Sitting or standing with poor posture on a consistent basis affects proper blood flow through the body's tissues, thus increasing a person's risk for MSIs, like back injuries, neck injuries, leg injuries. We often don't see the association with neck injuries with static sitting or standing, but our neck does take a fair amount of stress and strain from the static loading, static muscle activity to maintain a posture, to keep the arms in a static position to be able to type in mouse, for example. The spine. So the back or the spine is the most frequent part of the body injured in Newfoundland and Labrador workplaces. As I said, the spine is comprised of 33 bones called vertebrae that stack on top of one another to form a flexible column. The top 24 vertebrae are movable, and this movable part can be broken down into 3 sections or 3 regions. The cervical spine, which is your neck, the thoracic spine, your middle back, and your lumbar or lower back, lumbar spine. This is the location where the majority of back injuries occur. It's usually the result of changing the low back's shape and placing too much load on it. Bands of ligaments hold the vertebrae together to prevent unwanted movement. Layers of muscles run along your spine, in front, back, and along your sides to control movement of your trunk and your upper limbs. Separating each vertebra is a shock-absorbing flexible ring of cartilage called an intervertebral disc or spinal disc. Your spine is curved like an S when viewed sideways. This S-shaped configuration is important to maintain and ensures an even distribution of body weight and the ability to respond to different physical forces. Activating your core muscles by contracting them or firming them up stabilizes your spine and helps to maintain this S shape, this neutral back posture. Core muscle activation is one of the key principles of good body mechanics and helps prevent back injuries. You're literally bracing your spine when you activate those core or trunk muscles. So just picture for a moment what you would do if someone were about to jab you or punch you in the belly. Naturally, you would firm up. You're bracing yourself for that impact that's about to unfold. That firming up is exactly the feeling that you should feel when I say that you should activate your core. To stand, to sit, to walk, to do lifting activities, to do any of your work activities, there should be some firmness at your core. Now, I don't expect that you would hold that amount of tension. You want to have that feeling, but back off on the amount of tension. You don't want to have maximal contraction at your core. That's very fatiguing. You want to be able to breathe normally and naturally when there's still a bit of tension, a little bit of firmness at your core. The difference is that you're not sucking your belly in. There's actually no change in the shape of your belly. You're just tightening things up. It's like you're shrink wrapping your trunk, the muscles around your spine. So it's firm up, but not sucking the belly. Neutral posture is the place that you want to be in your daily activities. The back is a neutral posture when those three spinal curves, the cervical, thoracic, and lumbar spine, are maintained. In this position, the spine is under the least amount of stress and muscles are their strongest. The same is true for the remaining joints. And I'll point out too, it's the lumbar spine that's most important that we maintain that natural shape. So the natural curve in our low back, the curve that we can feel in our low back, that's our lumbar spine. That's the part of the back that takes the most stress and strain throughout our life. And it's the part of the spine that is designed to be less flexible. And the intent, I guess the principle of preventing back injuries is that we actually not change the shape of our lumbar spine as much as possible throughout our day, at work, at home, at rest, etc. We want to maintain the natural curvature in the spine when we're doing our work activities. If you've not sat or stood in neutral posture for a while, neutral posture might seem awkward to you or feel uncomfortable, but keep practicing and the neutral posture will eventually become more normal for you and certainly more healthy for you. A twisted or bent back posture increases stress on the back tissues and increases the risk of injury. So let's just look at that now in the seated and standing position. So starting with standing, it begins with a good base of support. You want to have your feet about hip width apart and the equal distribution of your body weight through both legs. This means no leaning of your body weight onto one hip. Stand erect with a nice natural upright spine, S-shaped spine, with your core engaged, so your trunk musculature firmed up a bit. Face straight ahead, have your eyes looking ahead with a slight downward gaze. Your arms just hang relaxed at your sides. Your shoulders are not elevated to reach a keyboard or other work object that's too high. Your wrists are straight in line with your hands are in line with your arms. Your ears are over your shoulders and not ahead of your shoulders. Your shoulders are over your hips and not in front of your hips, as often seen when a worker leans across a line to overreach for product. The best elbow angle to do work using the hands depends on the type of work that's being performed. For computer work though, the elbows should be at roughly a 90-degree angle. That means that your elbow height should be, or your keyboard height should be at the same height as your elbows or your armrest on your chair. In order to work in this neutral standing posture, your workstation has to be designed for you. For example, your work surface at the proper height and your materials within easy reach. These two images depict neutral and awkward standing postures. So the image on the right is an illustration of what happens when we stand stationary for long periods of time. The body starts to tire once the threshold has been reached. So thresholds are based on the individual and what your body can withstand. One person might be able to stand for 30 minutes without tiring and stand in that nice neutral posture, while another may tire after just 2 or 3 minutes. Once you reach the limit, your body will likely shift its weight and you'll lean into one of your hips. This shift in weight causes your low back to excessively curve, placing an uneven pressure on your discs while placing additional stress on both of your hips and knees and on your knee joint of your supporting leg. Poll question number 2, and I hope we have better success with this poll question. So a footrest can be used for standing work. True or false? Tina is launching the poll. The answer is true. 64% are correct. A footrest can be used for standing work. However, the footrest looks a little different than for seated work. To use a footrest while we're standing, we're only raising one foot at a time onto a platform. And for a standing footrest, typically the footrest would be higher than a seated footrest. May not always be the case depending on your individual size and that sort of thing, but a comfortable height for many people is about 13 centimeters or 5 inches in height for a footrest. Many people like to raise one foot onto a footrest when they're standing. In order to help prevent low back discomfort. If a footrest is used, it's important to maintain an upright posture and not lean all of your body weight into one hip. Okay, so that is one of the drawbacks of using a footrest, is that people sometimes will just let go of the upper body firmness and they just rest their body weight into that one hip when one leg is raised. That's what you don't want to do. You need to have that upright posture, fully supported and engaged upper body. If you're starting to lean into your hip, that could also be a sign that you've just fatigued and it's time for a change in posture. So perhaps switch legs, or don't use a footrest and just have 2 of your feet on the floor now, or perhaps sit for a while, or even take a little movement break and walk around for a minute or so. Okay, so when you start to lean your weight into your hip, it's a sign that you need to change posture. Neutral posture for sitting is very similar to that of standing. Sitting in neutral posture requires that S-shaped spine. You're facing straight ahead. Your ears are over your shoulders. Once again, you don't have that gooseneck posture with your neck coming forward, your head coming forward. Your arms hang relaxed at your body sides. Again, your shoulders are not elevated. Your elbows are bent at 90 degrees. Your hands are in that handshaking position. Your hips are at about a 93 to 103 degree angle. This tends to be the most beneficial in regards to less stress on the back tissues. Your knees are at a 90 degree angle, or it could be a wider angle, a larger angle. Certainly if you're using a footrest that's on an angle, your knees will be opened up more. The main thing is you don't want to have your knees too close towards your bum. So they shouldn't be any closer than 90 degree angle. And you want your feet firmly supported on a floor or a footrest. That's another very key point for the prevention of back discomfort. If our feet are not fully supported on a floor or footrest, we put a lot of extra strain on our core and back muscles to maintain that upright posture. And it's very fatiguing, and it can set us up for back discomfort. Proper body mechanics. So referring back to the previous slide, using proper body mechanics is a control measure for MSI prevention. Body mechanics refers to the way we move about in our daily activities. It's the way we walk, the way we move into standing position, the way we move into sitting position, the way we move to pick up a load, the way we move to do all of our activities. The goal is to use proper body mechanics. Proper body mechanics combine the principles of safe postures with efficient, controlled movement. We use stronger muscles in the legs and hips and trunk to promote movement while maintaining that natural S-shaped spine, keeping the elbows in and close to our body sides. We want to design our workstations to fit us rather than expecting us to adapt to a poor work design. Okay, so can't be emphasized enough, we need to maintain that S-shaped spine, okay, to protect back, prevent back injuries. This is not only for the handling of loads, but it's also when we go to sit in a chair, to come out of a chair into standing, when we're walking. We want to walk with a nice upright posture with our core engaged, and that engaged core locks the spine in its natural position. So it's very spine protective. So engaging the core is very important for preventing back injuries. When you're moving about, when you're moving your body, doing your work activities, you want to move about your hip joints. Okay, so the shape of your back should not change at all. You're simply moving about your hip joints. If you must reach forward to bend over for something, instead of bending your back, you just bend about your hip joints and keep your trunk stiff. Don't round out your back. When you go to walk, once again, you don't want to walk with a loose core. Walk with an engaged core, keeping your back in that neutral posture. When you're sitting, you want to stand, keep your trunk stiff, and use your leg muscles to rise up, so on and so forth. This is what it looks like, hip bending. So notice how this person's lumbar spine curvature remains. It's maintained, and the movement is occurring about the hips and the knees. Her bum comes back and down. So it's kind of following a 45-degree trajectory. The hips go back and down. You can almost call it squat back. Don't just squat down. Instead, squat back and down. So the bum comes behind you and then down. The 6 techniques listed on the slide are safe techniques to use to lift loads in various lifting scenarios. We've got the squat lift, the lunge lift, the golfer's lift, partial squat lift, shoulder height to overhead lift, and 2-person lift. Workplace NL has short video clips and a 1-page safety share for each one of these techniques. It describes how to do these safely, and I encourage you to visit our website at workplacenl.ca and view these video clips and safety shares. As well, we have them for carrying, pushing, and pulling. One key message today is that if you can avoid lifting and carrying, you should, and preferably push, pull, or slide objects instead. And if you have a choice of pushing or pulling, it's safer to push than it is to pull. The safe lifting and handling principles are: you widen your stance, you activate the core muscles as I mentioned, you always bend about your hips, so you're squatting back first. That's the very first motion, is your bum is squatting back and down. Avoid twisting your torso, keep your load close to the body, and handle loads smoothly. Multiple factors can affect your ability to work in neutral posture and use good body mechanics. They include the design and layout of your work area, which I talked about, characteristics of an item that's being handled, for example, a bulky load, the working environment. When we're working in cold conditions like cooler rooms, muscles work less effectively and are more prone to injury. And the processes or systems of work, the work organization and work practices. That looks at the job, the design of a job, right? So a job that requires repetitive motions, or if you don't have good flexibility to alternate tasks, if you have lack of task variety in your job. Take a Stand NL, MSI controls. There is a poster on our website as well, called Take a Stand NL. I think it's on labeled micro breaks poster, and it gives some tips on how to change your posture, get up and get more movement in your day. What can you do to escape the chair sentence? What can you do at work to move more? Well, this would typically be a question I'd ask you, but because we're running out of time, I'll just give you a couple of examples. If you sit a lot in your day, maybe you can use a small water glass and fill your water glass more regularly. Drink more water to hydrate your body. That certainly helps with hydration and lubricating your joints, reducing fatigue, and it gets you up out of your chair more often. Use the stairs instead of an elevator. Alternate your tasks. Don't do one long typing task. Break it up with something where you have to move. Have active breaks in your workday. Take regular micro breaks. After 20, 30 minutes of sitting, take a micro break. Get rid of personal garbage and recycling bins and just use a central bin in your work area, so it encourages you to get up and move. The key is to move often in order to keep the body systems working together. This stimulates blood flow and fuels and feeds the muscles. Muscles get to work together in a coordinated fashion, and it resets your body mechanics and your posture. So as I said, after 20 to 30 minutes of sitting, you want to stand and move for at least 1 or 2 minutes. This don't need to necessarily be a break from any work activities. It could be taking a phone call or placing a phone call while you're standing, especially if you're using a headset and you can use good posture. In general, the more repetitive your work activities, the more repetitive the motions, the higher the awkwardness of your positions. For example, if you don't have a good workstation design, the more frequent your micro breaks should be. So some ways to move often: make movement part of your work life. And we're going to go through these one by one. Plan your work, make workplace changes, and make breaks purposeful. Oh, sorry, I have to do that right here. So a couple of examples about planning your work is plan your work in advance. Don't schedule meetings back to back, or at least take 5 minutes or something in between a meeting. Make workplace changes. That looks at the design of your equipment. This is where we look at things like sit to stand workstations, and maybe in meeting rooms, having standing tables at the back of the room so you have an option to be able to change posture. And then making breaks purposeful. So having active breaks, taking your sneakers to work and actually getting out, or at least being able to walk around your building with good supportive footwear to get the blood flowing through your body. Last poll question is, which of the following statements is true? Take either a micro break or your regular break. Or number 2, take both. And the answer is take both. 100% of you got it right. Congratulations. We want to take both because having a standard break schedule of a 15-minute break after 2 hours of work, and then a 30 or 60-minute break after another 2 hours of work, and then followed by a second 15-minute break after another 2 hours of work, is just not enough to combat the health effects of prolonged postures and these other MSI risk factors that you might be exposed to, like repetitive motions. So we need to be having regular micro breaks in order for the musculoskeletal system to get the adequate amount of rest and recovery. However, we can't simply replace our breaks with just micro breaks. We need to have longer breaks as well so the muscles can get the real adequate rest and recovery needed. We need a good supply of micro breaks in addition to our regular breaks. There is some software that you can download on your computer. There's many that are free of charge. If you're interested in learning about them, certainly send me an email. I'll have my information at the back, at the end slide here, and I can send you some examples of some free software downloads. And I guess I'd just say finally that we really want to be cognizant of the way that we're walking and moving our body just in our everyday life when we're walking around. Good body mechanics is nutrition for the body. When you really think about it, we aim for a minimum of 10,000 steps a day. That tends to be the usual recommendation for active people. 10,000 steps a day is 36 million steps in 10 years. Imagine taking every one of those steps with poor posture, with an unsupported spine, with an unengaged core. Eventually, this is going to lead to breakdown in your spine and eventual discomfort and pain and issues with the back. So a quick knowledge check. What's wrong with this picture? The head is forward. He's in a gooseneck posture. His ears should not be in front of his shoulders. He has a rounded C-shaped spine when in fact he should have an S-shaped spine. His back should be supported into the backrest of his chair, taking some of the stress and strain off of his back by using his chair to support him. And his lumbar spine in particular should maintain the natural curvature. The monitor is too low. Oh, no, wrong one. The shoulders are rounded forward. That's a typical posture of someone who is working with tools that are too far in front of them on a regular basis. The shoulders tend to round forward. Now we have tight chest muscles and stretched upper back muscles, causing us to have really poor posture. The arms are too far away. The elbows should be at the body sides. This means that his mouse and keyboard are too far in front of him. And finally, the monitor is too low. And because of that, he's looking down, he's bending his neck, putting him in that gooseneck posture, and that's really straining on the neck, setting him up for a neck injury. So that's it. That's a wrap. During this webinar, we reviewed and discussed the roles and responsibilities of workplace parties, worker education and instruction requirements, neutral postures, particularly neutral sitting and neutral standing postures, and the principles of body mechanics and the importance of movement throughout your day. Stay tuned for some upcoming webinars. We have 4 more this week, 1 a day, which are part of the Move Well, Work Well delivery service Workplace NL is providing. The webinar tomorrow is MSI Hazards in the Construction Industry. Then on Wednesday, we have Ergonomics Protecting the Aging Workforce. On Thursday, MSI Tips for a Healthy Workday. And just a reminder that Made Safe NL is delivering a webinar, co-facilitating with me at Workplace NL on MSI Hazard Recognition, Evaluation, and Control on Thursday afternoon. You register via Made Safe NL's website, which Tina has sent out the link for. And Friday, we have computers and mobile computing devices, MSI prevention tips for using these types of devices. All right, if you would like to subscribe to our, I'm not even sure what it's called, our subscription. I'm not really sure what it's called, but I guess our email mail out that tells you when upcoming workshops and webinars are happening. Then you just click on this view all events on the bottom of our main page of our website at www.workplacenl.ca. Click on, then click here to subscribe to our newsletter, it's called. Sorry, I was lost for words there. And you'll receive those emails from Workplace NL. Thank you very much for attending. I appreciate it, and your feedback is important. So just a reminder to complete your evaluation at the end. You can contact me directly at 778-1124 with any questions. And you can also reach me via email at cheryllee.osborne@workplacenl.ca. So CHERYLEE.OSBORNE@workplacenl.ca. Or you can always reach either one of our offices in St. John's, Grand Falls, or Corner Brook. Thanks so much, everybody. Enjoy your day.